A dog walks into a hospital and transforms the life of a desperate family. It was a cold, overcast morning. At St. Mary's Hospital, the hum of machines and the quiet murmurs in the hallways were the only companions for families awaiting news of their loved ones. Doctors walked briskly, nurses organized patient charts, and amidst all that tiring routine, no one noticed the unusual visitor who passed through the automatic doors. A dog. Of medium size, the animal had golden fur, dusty and unkempt, and large eyes that seemed to observe everything with unusual attentiveness. No one knew how he had gotten in. There was no sign of a collar or an owner nearby. He didn't bark, didn't growl, and, surprisingly, didn't cause any commotion. It was as if he had a purpose and a certainty of where he needed to be. The dog walked slowly, sniffing the floor and carefully observing the people who passed by. Staff members, too preoccupied with their tasks, merely glanced at him for a moment before moving on. "Whose dog is that?" murmured a distracted receptionist before returning to her phone call. No one seemed concerned. After all, he wasn't bothering anyone. But something felt unsettling. The dog ignored the busy hallways and the common areas. He moved through the corridors as though he already knew the place. His lowered tail and attentive ears showed he was focused, determined. He climbed a ramp, passed through a pediatric wing, and finally stopped. Suddenly, the dog stood still. His gaze was fixed on a closed door at the end of the corridor. The number on the plaque read, "Room 207. Inside, a family was suffering in silence. The Williams couple, Sarah and Michael, sat beside a hospital bed where their daughter, Emily, just 7 years old, lay resting, fragile and pale. Emily was battling a rare illness. Hours dragged on like days, and the doctors had already warned that the situation was critical. "Do you think she'll get better?" Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes as she held her little girl's hand. Michael didn't respond. He only stared at the floor, trying to hide the pain tearing through his chest. Outside, the dog remained motionless. He tilted his head to the side, as if listening to something. Then, without hesitation, he stepped closer and scratched the door with his paw. Once, twice, 3 times. "What's that?" asked a nurse passing by. She approached, trying to shoo him away. "Go on, get out of here." But the dog didn't move. He just stared at the door, his slow breathing making him appear determined to enter. His gaze wasn't that of a lost animal, but of someone who knew they had arrived at the right place. The nurse sighed, unable to understand the dog's stubbornness. Something about him made her uneasy. She called for a security guard, but before he could arrive, a sound echoed through the hallway. The door to the room opened. Michael, his face tired, appeared in the doorway and looked down at the dog in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, surprised. The dog lifted his head, his eyes locked onto Michael's, as though speaking without words. A connection formed, inexplicable, yet powerful, in that silent moment. And then, as if asking permission, the dog stepped forward. "Daddy, who is it?" came Emily's weak voice from inside the room. Michael hesitated. He looked at the animal before him, feeling as though something much larger was happening. "Let him in, Michael," Sarah whispered softly from inside the room, not even knowing why. With a mixture of doubt and hope, Michael held the door open. Without waiting any longer, the dog walked into the room, heading straight to the bed where Emily lay. What would he do next? Silence filled room 207 as the dog entered. Each step he took seemed deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he needed to go. Sarah, sitting beside the bed, widened her eyes, while Michael slowly closed the door, his gaze never leaving the animal. "Who let him in?" Sarah murmured, almost in a whisper. Michael shrugged, still in shock. He wouldn't leave. It's like he came here on purpose." Sarah fell silent, watching the dog as he approached Emily's bed. With a gentle movement, the animal placed his front paws on the edge of the bed and looked at the little girl. Emily was so weak, she hardly seemed to notice the unusual presence beside her. Her fine, disheveled blonde hair framed her pale face, partly obscured by the oxygen mask. "Emily, sweetheart, look," Sarah whispered, softly touching her daughter's arm. The girl opened her eyes slowly, her eyelids heavy. Then she saw the dog. Her pale blue eyes lit up, for the first time in days, with a glimmer of curiosity. "A dog?" Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. The dog watched her with such intensity, it seemed as though he understood. Slowly, he lay down on the floor beside the bed, resting his head on his paws. His eyes never left Emily, as if he were guarding her. "Where did he come from?" Sarah asked, still concerned. Michael, seated in a chair near the window, shook his head. "I have no idea. He came out of nowhere, but he seems calm, almost like he knows he's supposed to be here." For a moment, the parents forgot the fear and despair that had tormented them for weeks. The dog, though just a strange animal, brought an inexplicable calm to the room. The Williams family's desperation had begun months earlier. Emily had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive condition that doctors struggled to control. For weeks, test results showed nothing but decline. Each day was a new fight, a silent battle against time. Sarah and Michael, worn down by sleepless nights, no longer knew what to do. The only thing keeping them going was the hope for a miracle. In that same hospital, expert doctors, costly treatments, and long nights of prayer had become routine. But nothing seemed to work. Emily grew frailer with each passing day. Sarah had stopped working, dedicating herself entirely to her daughter, while Michael struggled to keep up with the bills. The family was at its breaking point, physically and emotionally. "What's going to happen to her, Michael?" Sarah had asked countless times in quiet conversations Emily couldn't hear. "She'll get better. She has to," he always replied, even when his tears betrayed him. But now, seeing the dog lying beside Emily's bed, something shifted. It wasn't rational. It wasn't scientific. Yet, for some reason, the animal seemed to bring a new energy into the room. Then, something unexpected happened. Emily slowly lifted her hand, weak and trembling, and stretched her fingers toward the dog. "Come here," she whispered. As if understanding her, the dog lifted his head and moved closer to the bed. With surprising gentleness, he rested his muzzle on the blanket, near Emily's fingers. The little girl touched the top of his head. For the first time in weeks, a smile, faint but real, appeared on her lips. Sarah brought her hands to her face, holding back a sob. "My God," she whispered. "Did you see that, Michael? She smiled." Michael stared at the scene, astonished. That simple gesture, a touch between the sick child and the unknown dog, felt like a miracle. "I don't know who he is," Michael murmured, "but maybe he came here for a reason." Just then, a nurse entered the room, carrying Emily's medications. She froze when she saw the dog. "What's this dog doing here? He can't—" Sarah stood up, her voice almost pleading. "Please, don't take him away." Emily smiled. She hasn't smiled in weeks. The nurse hesitated. She looked at the girl, then at the dog, who now lay silently, as though he knew he couldn't cause trouble. "All right," the nurse said softly. "Just for today. But please, don't let anyone see him." Sarah nodded gratefully. Once the nurse left, she looked at Michael and whispered, "Maybe he's the answer we've been waiting for." Michael said nothing, but deep down, something in his heart agreed. The dog wasn't just a strange visitor. He seemed to have a purpose, a reason for being there with Emily. In that room, amidst the fight against illness and silent despair, there was now a new thread of hope. And it had arrived in the form of an unknown dog, one no one could explain. The next morning arrived with timid sunlight filtering through the curtains of room 207. Sarah was asleep in the armchair, her head tilted to the side, while Michael tried to rest, leaning against the wall. At the center of that small room, the steady hum of the monitors tracked Emily's fragile breathing. And at the foot of the bed, the dog was still there. He hadn't moved all night. He hadn't cried, barked, or even attempted to explore the room. He just lay there, silent, like a watchful guardian. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, as if he was doing exactly what needed to be done. Around 7 in the morning, Emily stirred awake. Her eyes opened slowly, and her first glance fell on the dog, who raised his head as soon as he noticed her movement. Emily smiled faintly, and her small fingers once again reached out toward him. "You're still here?" she whispered, her voice weak. The dog wagged his tail gently, as if to answer, "Yes." It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried a different kind of energy. Something about their connection was inexplicable, almost magical. Sarah woke at the sound of her daughter's voice. She rose quickly, surprised. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, trying to hide her exhaustion. "Are you feeling better?" Emily nodded, her gaze still fixed on the dog. "He stayed with me all night, Mommy," she said, her smile growing just a little brighter. Sarah bit her lip, overwhelmed with emotion. She looked at the animal and noticed something strange. The dog didn't seem tired or restless. His expression was calm, attentive, almost human. At that moment, Michael woke up as well. "He's still here?" he asked, looking at the animal. "Still," Sarah replied. "I think he helped Emily. Look at her today." Michael approached the bed and gazed at his daughter. Emily's cheeks had a faint hint of color, her eyes seemed brighter, and her breathing was steadier. It was a small change, but for parents who had seen nothing but decline for weeks, it felt like a miracle. "What kind of dog is this?" Michael muttered, deep in thought. Suddenly, the dog did something that caught everyone's attention. He stood up, his ears perked forward, as though hearing a distant sound. His posture shifted. He was alert. "What is it?" Sarah asked, surprised. The dog stepped toward the door and began scratching at it softly with his paw. He turned to look at Michael and Sarah, as if trying to tell them something. "He wants out," Michael said, frowning. "But why?" Sarah questioned. "He stayed here all night." Michael walked to the door and opened it slowly. The dog slipped through with surprising agility, turning right and, heading down the hallway. It was as if something unseen was guiding him. Michael glanced at Sarah, bewildered. "I'm going to follow him," he said. "What? Why?" "I don't know, but something tells me he's trying to show us something." Michael stepped into the hallway, following the dog, who moved quickly and with purpose. Nurses and doctors went about their routines, but no one seemed to notice the animal. He passed by, unseen, almost invisible, to everyone except Michael. After descending ATE ramp and crossing the main corridor, the dog stopped in front of a glass door that led to a small chapel inside the hospital. Michael watched him, confused. "Here. Is this where you wanted to go?" The dog turned his head toward him, then looked back at the door, as though waiting for something. Michael pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chapel was empty, illuminated by soft light streaming through the stained glass windows. The wooden pews smelled faintly of varnish, and the silence felt almost sacred. The dog followed him in, stopping in the center of the room. "Why did you bring me here?" Michael whispered. The dog sat and tilted his head, his gaze fixed on the altar. Michael followed the dog's line of sight. There, on a small table, lay an open prayer book and a single lit candle. Beside the candle was an old photograph, a child holding a dog that looked almost identical to the one now at his side. Michael's heart raced as he approached. Carefully, he picked up the Baikito photo and examined it closely. It was a black and white picture, worn with age. "This can't be," he murmured. The child in the photo bore a striking resemblance to his daughter, Emily. It was as though he were looking at an older version of her. And the dog? It was identical to the one sitting at his feet. Michael sat down on one of the pews, a chill running through him. "Who are you?" he asked the dog, who simply stared back with those deep, shining eyes. He didn't know how, but in that moment, he was certain. This animal was no ordinary dog. He was here for a greater reason, something Michael couldn't yet comprehend. Suddenly, the distant sound of an alarm echoed through the hospital. Michael jumped to his feet. "Emily!" he exclaimed. The dog was already moving, sprinting back down the hallway as if he knew exactly what was happening. Michael followed closely, his heart pounding in his chest, terrified of what he would find when he returned to room 207. The sound of the alarm blared through the corridor, making Michael's heart race erratically. He ran as fast as he could, the dog leading the way, as if it knew exactly what was happening. Nurses rushed past, and doctors moved toward room 207. When Michael reached the door, chaos greeted him. Sarah stood beside the bed, crying, while a medical team worked urgently on Emily. "What happened?" he shouted, breathless. "She started experiencing a sharp drop in her vitals," a nurse replied. "We're stabilizing her." Sarah looked at Michael, desperation in her eyes. "Michael, please, do something!" The dog, who had been standing still beside Michael, suddenly pushed into the room. The nurses tried to hold him back. "Get that dog out of here!" a doctor shouted. "No, let him stay!" Michael pleaded, his urgency surprising everyone. Something inside him screamed that the dog had a role to play. What happened next was inexplicable. While the medical team worked, the dog stopped beside Emily's bed. Carefully, he placed his front paws on the mattress and, as if it were a conscious gesture, gently pressed his nose against the girl's hand. The heart monitor, which had been showing Emily's weak heartbeat, began to emit a different sound. Slowly, the numbers started stabilizing. "Her vitals are improving!" a nurse exclaimed in surprise. The doctor, stunned, glanced between the monitor and the dog. "What is happening?" Michael gripped Sarah's shoulders, both of them in tears. Emily's breathing grew calmer, and her face, pale just moments before, began to regain a faint, healthy color. Her fingers twitched, weak but unmistakably alive. "Mommy? Daddy?" Her voice, though faint, was audible. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. "I'm here, my love. We're right here." The dog lay back down beside the bed, his eyes fixed on Emily, as though ensuring her recovery continued. The room fell silent, everyone frozen, unable to explain what they had just witnessed. Later that day, after Emily had been stabilized and drifted into peaceful sleep, Michael knew he had to find answers. The photograph in the chapel wouldn't leave his mind, and he needed to understand what connected this dog to his family. With his heart pounding, he sought out the hospital's director, an elderly woman named Margaret Keller, who had worked there for over 30 years. "Ms. Keller, I need to speak with you about a photo I found in the chapel," Michael began. A photo of a child with a dog. The director looked at him, surprised. "What photo?" "In the chapel," he insisted. "The child, she looks so much like my daughter Emily, and the dog is identical to the one with us now." Margaret fell silent for a moment before finally replying, "Come with me. There's something you need to know." She led Michael to an old archive where hospital records were stored. After a few minutes of searching through dusty papers and faded photos, Margaret pulled out an aged image. It was the same photograph Michael had seen in the chapel. "This was many years ago," Margaret began. "The boy in the photo was named Thomas, and he suffered from an illness very similar to your daughter's. He came to this hospital often, always accompanied by his dog, a golden retriever named Buddy." Michael swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" Margaret sighed. "Thomas fought bravely, but his illness progressed. Buddy, his loyal companion, never left his side. It was as though the dog could feel the boy's pain, trying to carry it for him. When Thomas passed away, Buddy stayed at the hospital's entrance for days, waiting for his friend to return." "My God," Michael murmured. "After that, there were strange reports," Margaret continued, her voice tinged with mystery. "Families claimed to see a dog in the hospital, always near sick children, as if watching over them. Some believe it's the spirit of Buddy, still fulfilling his mission to protect those in need." Michael felt a chill run through him. He thought of how the dog had found Emily's room, stayed with her through the night, and, most importantly, seemed to save her during that critical moment. Is that possible?" Michael asked, almost whispering. Margaret offered a gentle smile. "Sometimes things happen that we can't explain, but I believe true love never really fades. Maybe Buddy found Emily because he knew she needed him." At that moment, everything clicked. The dog wasn't just a stray visitor, he was a protector, an inexplicable presence that appeared in the darkest moments. When Michael returned to Emily's room, he found Sarah sitting by the bed, gently stroking the dog, who still lay quietly at Emily's side, like a faithful shadow. Emily was awake, her soft smile bringing a serenity Michael hadn't seen in weeks. "Daddy, look, he's helping me," she said, her voice stronger than before. Michael knelt beside the bed and ran his hand over the dog's head, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. The dog wagged his tail gently, as if he understood. In that moment, Michael no longer needed explanations. He knew, deep in his heart, that this animal had been sent to protect Emily and bring hope to their family in a way no one could ever explain. The days that followed were marked by an extraordinary transformation in room 207. The dog, now lovingly called Buddy by Emily, became a part of their delicate routine. He never left her side. Whether sitting at the foot of the bed or lying with his nose resting gently on the little girl's feet, Buddy seemed to radiate an inexplicable peace as though he had the power to calm her soul and ease her pain. Doctors and nurses watched the scene with a mix of admiration and awe. Emily's recovery was something no one could explain. Her vitals continued to stabilize day by day. She started eating better, her cheeks regained their color, and in a moment that brought tears to Sarah and Michael's eyes, Emily asked to sit up. "I want to play with Buddy," she said, smiling. It was the first time her voice had sounded alive in months. Michael and Sarah watched in disbelief as Emily's small hand stroked Buddy's soft fur. The dog wagged his tail happily, as though he were proud to see her doing so well. It was as if he knew his mission was working. That same week, the doctors called Sarah and Michael in for a meeting. Dr. Andrews, Emily's lead physician, held her latest test results, visibly perplexed. "I can't explain what's happening," he began, looking at the parents. "The most recent results show significant improvement in Emily's condition. The illness is regressing in a way that has no medical explanation." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "When you first came here weeks ago, the prognosis was extremely bleak. But now, Emily is responding to treatment in a way we've never seen before." Michael smiled and glanced at Sarah. Tears streamed down her face. "It's not the treatment, doctor," Sarah whispered. "It's Buddy." The doctor frowned, confused. "Buddy?" "The dog," Michael explained, overcome with emotion. "Since he arrived, everything has changed." Emily smiled for the first time in months. "She's stronger. She's improving. Because of him." Dr. Andrews paused, staring at the couple. He was a man of science, a respected professional. But even he knew some things could not be explained with data or theories alone. "Whatever it is," he said finally, "let that dog stay close to her. If he brings comfort, perhaps he brings far more than we can understand." Another week passed, and Emily was well enough to get out of bed. Still weak, but smiling brightly, she held Buddy's makeshift leash as she walked slowly down the hospital corridor, accompanied by Michael and Sarah. Nurses and doctors stopped to watch, some smiling and others with tears in their eyes. That simple walk was nothing short of a miracle. "Look, Buddy," Emily said, pointing toward the windows. "It's a beautiful day outside. Soon we'll play in the park. You'll see." Buddy wagged his tail, always by her side, like a loyal guardian. That night, back in her room, Emily fell asleep faster than usual. Sarah tucked her in gently, kissed her forehead, then sat beside Michael. The dog, as always, lay at the foot of the bed. But there was something different about him. "He's quieter tonight, don't you think?" Sarah whispered. Michael looked at Buddy, who seemed to breathe slowly, his eyes half closed, as though he were tired. Michael leaned in and stroked his head. "You've done a good job, Buddy," Michael murmured, his throat tight with emotion. Buddy lifted his eyes to Michael for just a moment and wagged his tail one last time, as if to say, "My mission is complete." The next morning, when Sarah woke up, something caught her attention. Buddy was gone. The space where he had been lying was empty. "Michael, Buddy's gone," she said, searching the room. Michael sat up quickly, but there was no sign of the dog. They asked the nurses, checked the reception desk, and even looked outside the hospital. No one had seen Buddy leave. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. When they returned to the room, they found Emily sitting up, smiling. "Where's Buddy?" Michael asked, trying to hide his worry. Emily looked at him serenely. "He left, Daddy." "How do you know that?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. "He told me it was okay now, that I didn't need him anymore," Emily replied, holding the teddy bear she had carried since the beginning of her hospitalization. Sarah and Michael exchanged a tearful glance. They knew Buddy wasn't an ordinary dog. He had come into their lives like a guardian angel, fulfilled his mission, and left silently. A few weeks later, Emily was discharged from the hospital. Her recovery continued to amaze everyone, and she returned home with her parents, smiling and full of life. On the way back, Sarah looked out the window and saw a dog that looked just like Buddy sitting on the sidewalk. But as the car passed, he was gone. "Did you see that?" she asked, tears in her eyes. Michael smiled softly. "Maybe he's still around, watching over us from afar." From the back seat, Emily looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Buddy." Sometimes miracles appear in the most unexpected ways, in the silent presence of a stray dog, in the unspoken bond between an animal and a human, heart, or in hope reborn when all seems lost. Buddy may have been an angel, a spirit, or simply a very special dog. But, to the Williams family, he was the answer to their prayers. And you? Have you ever witnessed something you couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments, and remember, sometimes hope comes from the most unlikely places.